Okay, so today we're going to talk about your artist statement or your creative statement, depending on what medium you're working in or depending on what your goals are. A lot of this has been tailored to people that are working kind of cross-platform, where you are considering working in the art world in some way or in context of a gallery, or something that might be funded by grants or something that might be funded by monies from larger institutions. But this also applies to if you're doing advertising work, if you're pitching a project, if you're trying to communicate the work that you're doing for a particular project. All right, so let's just get into it. What even is an artist statement or creative statement, and like why should you care? Why should you use one? The biggest thing that we use an artist statement for really is just simply like contextualizing your work. Now, this again could look like several different things depending on what your medium is, depending on what your goals are, depending on what you're doing. But in all cases, you're still going to be communicating the intentions of your work. And now we've talked about this before. No matter what your intentions are, if it's not in the work, that can be problematic. So ideally and theoretically, your intentions should be realized in the work. That should be something that is attained or pushed towards in the work. But you should be able to identify what your intentions are with your work. In the same way, and some of this is, more transparent depending on if you're doing advertising work, then this is going to be probably fairly easy for you to answer. But if you're working in a fine art spectrum, it might be a bit more challenging. But what do you hope the work will do? Like within reason, of course. I wouldn't use statements like, I hope it changes the world. I hope it changes, maybe back off of the grandiose statements a bit. But you really need to consider, well, why am I making this work, and what is it doing? What should it do? What do I hope? What are my intentions and my hopes? What direction is the work heading towards in a broader context of society? And I think probably the most important one, and this is leaning more towards probably the editorial, more towards the fine art and that kind of spectrum, probably less towards advertising, but towards those art, editorial, documentary modes. I would definitely try to identify, like, what are the questions that you're asking with your work? What are the things that you're calling into question, whether it's social norms, whether it's it could be millions of different things. It could simply be like what our idea of a town is, what our idea of how people interact, what's normal, all these types of things. Like what is your work question? What does it seek to ask? I think the best work, of course, is good at asking questions, not necessarily delivering a bunch of answers. Questions are much more interesting than answers oftentimes. So it's good for you to be able to identify what those questions might be. Okay, so on just some structural things, I would suggest for sure having kind of two versions of an artist statement or a creative statement. One I call like the elevator pitch, and one is kind of more in depth. So there's a short version and there's a long version. And again, it's very important to have both of these things, because depending on who needs to read them and where you need to share them, you will use both of these interchangeably and for different purposes. So it's good to go ahead and do both of them at the same time so that you have them ready to go. Okay, so the first one should be like 50 to 100 words, and that's the one that I think of as like an elevator pitch. That should just be as quick as possible, getting right to the details of your goals and what you're trying to do and what you're doing with your work. And it's called an elevator pitch because literally this would be, an encapsulation of what you're doing that you would explain to someone on an elevator ride. And you may literally be doing this. What if you run into a gallerist, or you run into a curator, or you run into a producer, or a number of people, and you need to explain what you're doing in a very quick, small time frame? It's good to have 50 to 100 words put together. Maybe you don't memorize them verbatim, but you know exactly kind of the points you're trying to get across very quickly. So that way you can hit the highlights without going too in depth, because again, if you have 3 minutes or 5 minutes with somebody and you're barely halfway into point one by the time the door opens, you've lost them. So you need to be able to condense your idea as much as possible. But that doesn't need to be the only way you communicate what you're doing. You also need a longer version that, is about 10 times longer than that. That's, 500 to 1,000 words. And that will have, like more information in it. It'll have more contextual information, whether it's the historical context of what you're doing. It could be several different things. We're going to talk about a few common things that people use for the longer version of their creative statement. But this statement needs to show that you're very aware of what you're doing, and you've thought through what you're doing and how it applies to whichever context that this thing exists. Now, once you have these kind of the short statement and the long statement, you can also kind of tweak these depending on who's receiving it. Because depending on, whether you're submitting to a gallery, or if you're applying for funds somewhere, or if this is going in a publication, they may have different parameters of like 700 words or maybe 150 words. They may have kind of more specific things that they're looking for, even in the application process. But if you have your statement already done, you can add and subtract to it much easier than you can start from scratch like 2 weeks before the application's due and try to think, well, what am I doing? It's better to have these things done because you can always modify them. Modification is very common with your creative statement. You're not chained and beholden to your creative statement either. Like, as your project evolves, your statement will change, and things about your project as they become realized, that's going to change over time. So this is not a statement to fence you in. It's just kind of a checkpoint to where you can easily communicate as best you can what you're doing and how you're doing it. And the last thing that this is really helpful for is, like, if you need to do a press release, if you need to inform the public, having these little short, blurbs from a creative statement, especially that short creative statement, is easy to send to a newspaper if you're having a film opening, or send to a little publication that's going to run several of your pieces. All that stuff becomes really easy, and you already have it. You've already done it. So whenever those opportunities come up, you just attach the PDF and send it. It's really pretty straightforward. But you have to have it for that to be easy. And again, it's easier to modify it than to start from scratch. All right, so what are some common things that you might see on an artist statement or on a creative statement? First and foremost, it seems kind of obvious, but you should say what medium you're working in, whether that's photography, whether that's video, whether that's, some of you I know are doing fine artwork as well, whatever that work might be. Explain what medium you're in, just in case the person only sees the statement and they don't see your work first. They have some context. Talk about your process. And again, depending on if you're doing advertising work, this may not be as important, but it still might, depending on what your goals are. Definitely if you're working in a fine art spectrum, or if you are doing editorial work or documentary work or whatever, talk about your process. How do you go about doing what you're doing? Again, this could help with funding if you're using certain means to accomplish your goals, and those means are dependent on you having funding, then you need to be able to explain your process of getting where you're going. Now, this process could be literally the technical process of what you're doing. It could be a theoretical process of how you're thinking through what you're doing. It could be a philosophical process. That could mean a few different things, and you just have to align that again with what are your goals, like who are you as a creative person, and is this true to your work? Is this true to what you're making? Now, the second or the third and fourth one are a little more dependent on what medium you're working in. Of course, in a photographic medium and even video, you might talk about the type of camera that you're using or the type of film that you're using. This may depend on also the type of grant you're writing for, if that's something that you're doing. I find that the type of camera and film is probably less important for really what you're doing. It doesn't make that much of a difference. But if you're writing for a grant for, $2,000 for an equipment fund, it might be good to clarify exactly what type of equipment that you're using. And then also like the digital manipulation thing, if that's part of your practice that you're manipulating in some way, whether it's in still photography, whether it's in motion graphic work or video effects or whatever, I would talk about that. Like, what is it that you're doing in that process? And again, like this could unpack a few different ways, but in a nutshell, you're, like, what are you doing? Why are you doing it? And how are you doing it? Are the biggest kind of things you want to hit. What's your project? Why are you doing it? And how are you accomplishing it? But in saying that, there's some things that we need to be aware of that we're not doing. So here's a few things that I see done regularly in artist and creative statements that are terrible. Don't do this stuff. Okay, the first one is art babble. If you've ever been to an art gallery and read a statement, most of the time you're going to see a lot of fluffy, flowery words that no one uses except for in that world. Don't use art babble. Don't use art babble. Don't try to church up what you're doing with some big thesaurus words. I think that overly complicated artist statements are often seen as pretentious and seen as like, I want to impress you because I have looked up some technical stuff or some words that no one actually uses. When I think the best artist statements are the ones that you could give to like somebody that's not affiliated with that at all. So give it like to your grandmother or your mom or your dad or whoever. And if they can easily read it and understand it and they have no context in that medium, then it's probably you're doing well with it. I think our assumption is that we have to really impress people by like the complexity of what we're saying. But I think that doesn't work. It doesn't work well at all. So keep it simple. Don't be ignorant in what you're saying, but the goal is to communicate, not to, push people away. And then the third thing I would say that you should be aware of is don't reveal any mystery that might be in your work. Like if you overly explain what you're doing, you kill a lot of the surprise for people. You kill a lot of the mystery. And if you answer all the questions, then you don't give someone an opportunity to actually participate in the work. And that's, at the end of the day, the goal. You want someone to participate in your work, to feel connected to it, for it to resonate with them. So if you overly, if you answer everything, you reveal all the mysteries of what you're doing and why you're doing it and all that. If you overly explain it, you really kill a lot of opportunity there. So you have to find a balance. You have to give someone enough understanding that they have a place to work from, but don't explain answer every question, give them everything, lay it on the table. Now, for you, that's really important for you to be thinking through those things and to know those answers, but not necessarily for the person that you're writing a statement to. Okay. So I think, of course, like we use an artist statement and a creative statement for a client or for a gallery or for whatever publisher or whatever. But really, I think the biggest advantage to doing something like that is that it really helps you rethink your project. It helps you rethink and consider what your vision for your work is, what your mission for your work is. And if it's just floating around in your head, it's less likely for you to be able to really focus in on that. There's something that happens whenever you sit down, you write it out, you read what you've written, and you think, is this really what my goal is? Is this really what I'm doing? It's a commitment point. And that can be really, really good because it helps you strip away all the stuff that isn't particularly helpful or isn't correct with your work or something that maybe you've had an anxiety about that isn't true to your work. And also it helps you identify the things that are true about your work so that you can go deeper and focus in on those things. You have to refine your vision. You have to focus on your vision for your work. And it just floating around in the back of your head is not a good way to do that. So I think even just writing an artist statement for your own self, for your own project, can be really, really helpful to see what's working and what's not working, and see, is there a difference between what my intention started out as and what my work is actually doing? And you need to be able to identify, like what, your work is actually doing. But you can't do that until you understand what your intentions originally were, and you have to evaluate your intentions to see if they are working. I think that there's an aversion towards committing to a path, or committing to an idea, or committing to something for a lot of people. And by kind of just saying, this is what I'm doing, this is what my goals are, this is what my intentions are, you really are committing yourself, and that commitment helps you focus on what you're doing. And while I think that parsing out all of what you're doing and answering all those questions for your own self is good, I like to keep some of those details to myself. I still write them out, I still investigate what they are, but I withhold them probably from my public artist statement, because again, I don't want to overly explain to the degree that I crush the opportunity for the viewer. Okay, so let's look at one artist statement that I think is very well written. It functions, I think, ideally for what I think that a good artist statement should do, without kind of ruining it with art babble. And I'm going to read it to you. This is a statement by Doug Dubois, with his book My Last Day at 17, and it goes like this. The title, My Last Day at 17, was first uttered by Erin while I was taking her photograph in her parents' back garden on the eve of her 18th birthday. Okay, so first sentence, he explains the name of his work. He explains very clearly, pow, he just jumps right in. Although Erin argues her remark was more properly phrased, "It's my last day," as 17, the statement is the same. There is a time in everyone's life where the freedom and promise of childhood are lost on the coming of age and experience. The process can be gradual or abrupt. It can begin at age 18, 12, or 40. One paragraph, very clearly what the intention of the work is. You may not know exactly what you're going to see. You don't, you know exactly how it's going to work out. But we know this is talking about, it's a coming of age story. And we know that it is probably photographic, because he says he's making a photograph of this particular subject. Okay, so let's go into paragraph 2. The photographs were made over a 4-year period in the town of Cobe, County Cork in Ireland. Okay, so we have a place, we have the time frame, we have photographs. It's just kind of, it's less anecdotal. Like the first paragraph kind of is more of like, puts you right in the middle of that experience, and then he takes a step back and kind of is giving you an explanation. I came to Cobe at the invitation of the Serious Arts Center in the summer of 2009. Ireland had just begun its sharp decline from the boom years of the Celtic Tiger. I spent my days trying to integrate myself with contractors to gain access to, to ingratiate myself with contractors to gain access to building sites that lay abandoned throughout the Irish countryside. I got nowhere. Second paragraph, explaining his intentions and actually how his intentions failed. And this is a measure of transparency that I find like it's kind of a relief after reading a lot of artist statements. Like he says, like, this is what I wanted to do. I wanted to basically talk about economic issues, but I failed. It got nowhere. And I think that kind of humanizes him as the artist. Okay, let's move on. As part of my residency, I spent 2 or 3 afternoons each week with a small group of young people editing and designing a book of their photographs. After 2 weeks of frustration and little to show for my efforts at picturing Ireland's failing economy, I asked these kids to show me their neighborhood. Kevin and Erin, an inseparable couple at the time, took me to Russell Heights. Okay, so in 3 paragraphs, we're seeing kind of the low, and then it's starting to pick up to like where the project starts to come together. And very much, this is easy to read. There's no art babble in here. It's easy to work through this stuff. Anybody could read this and understand exactly what he's saying, which I think is great. Russell Heights is a housing estate of uncertain vintage that sits on Spy Hill above Cork Harbor. The neighborhood is closely knit. Everyone seems to be someone's cousin, former girlfriend, best friend, or spouse. Little can happen there that isn't seen, discussed, distorted beyond all reason, and fiercely defended against disapprobation from the outside. I probably wouldn't use that word because it's a little bit of a stumbler. Since I knew Kevin and Aaron, my camera and I were tolerated that first summer. Over the course of 4 summers, with hundreds of photographs made, given away, discussed, remade, and argued over, I earned a tenuous, don't use the word tenuous, a tenuous but quite touching sense of belonging. My last day at 17 looks at the bravado and adventure of childhood with an eye towards its fragility and inevitable loss. Some photographs were made spontaneously, but most were fashioned collaboratively, utilizing a chosen wardrobe, setting, and circumstance. While the lives imagined in this narrative are not to be confused with the actual individuals that walk the streets of Cobb, the photographs are faithful depictions of adolescent experience, the rhythm and patina of Russell Heights, and the anxious countenance of Irish youth. Okay, so if we're talking about short statement, long statement, the elevator pitch, and like the bigger unpacking, what we've just read is the bigger statement, is the bigger unpacking of the statement. But if we just look at that last paragraph is a perfect short version of everything we've read. In that last paragraph, we have exactly what he's doing, exactly what the work is working towards, where it is. Generally speaking, he could add, Cobb, Ireland in there to be more, specific, but adding one word, and there you go. You have like the whole statement done right there in that last. So that would be his elevator pitch. Like, bam, get in there fast. But by doing a bigger statement, we have a lot more context. We're humanizing these individuals, which is his goal. And we have a kind of a broader sense of what's going on here. So when we see the pictures, we should have some sort of a vague idea of what we're about to see. So let's look at a few of those pictures. Here's the first picture that this is Erin in her parents' garden. This is where he got the name of the book, right? This is Aaron. I think that's the other guy that he spoke about. But as you can see, they're not necessarily seen as high class societal people. They're kind of like middle class or middle lower class people in that area. There's a little bit of humor in the work. You have the kid on the light pole. But you see these houses that are all exactly the same. There's like sameness all the way through. You have this kind of like waffling back and forth between innocence and this kind of like loss of innocence, these scars of life that are existing. He has a very interesting way of photographing because he's working in a way that looks like documentary photography, and some pictures I'm sure might have been unstaged, but for the most part everything's staged. I mean, with this fire, I imagine that he didn't set up the fire for that to happen, but it's just the way that Doug photographs. It feels very natural, it feels very organic, it feels almost documentary in nature, even though most of his pictures are set up. Again, everything that's in a statement clearly comes out. You see these young people, you see them transitioning in life, you see the wear and tear of the spaces that they occupy, and how that gives us a context for them and their life. And even though a lot of these photographs are set up, they're very true in a broader sense of this is a true narrative about a culture of people, even if it's not exactly true for those individuals. Or maybe she wasn't wearing that shirt that day and he asked her to put the shirt on and hold the pot. but she's probably done something like this many, many times. It's really kind of trying to encapsulate a broader narrative. So, those images and that statement go together, I think, perfectly. I think it's very straightforward, and there's enough in the statement to allow you to look and investigate in the images and to connect with them in some way. Okay, so now that we've talked about other people's work, let's talk about yours. Let's talk about like what is your vision? Like, what do you want? And I think, this is a big question. It's kind of a lifelong question as a creative person, but it's one that you have to start working out right now. And ideally, your capstone project and the work that you're doing is pointing you to a broader vision and a broader desire. It should be pointing you that way, or you shouldn't be doing that capstone project. So you need to spend time and think about, like, what is my vision? Like, what type of work do I really want to do? What do I want to be a part of? And what kind of voice do I want to have in culture? And a way to start that is to write a creative statement, write an artist statement. So your task is going to be to write 2 creative statements. The elevator pitch, which is 50 to 100 words, and your kind of standard statement, which is like 500 to 1,000 words. For some of you, this might be really easy, and for others, it might be very difficult to do that. But I think it's very important for you to think about and to consider what you're doing. And when you write the statement, look at your work. And if your work isn't doing that, if it's not accomplishing some of those visions that you have, either you need to see what it's doing and change your intention, or you need to be more deliberate about what you're doing with your work. Maybe it's not that, like your intention is off or bad or wrong or ill-founded. Maybe your work is not there yet, and you need to put more time into getting your work where it needs to be. But you can't do that if you don't know what you're doing and you haven't kind of like made a declaration of what you're doing. So that is going to be your assignment. Write 2 versions of your creative statement: the short version, the elevator pitch, and the long version. And they can be a Word document or a PDF. It needs to be, formatted in something standard like APA or something. You can choose your formatting, but it needs to be something standard. And upload that to Canvas, and maybe we can chat about those next week sometime. That's going to be your focus for this week. All right. Thanks, everybody.